Welcome to Broadcasting Common Ground, the Deep Foundation Institute's podcast channel. In this series, DFI's Rumble, we will be speaking with opposing industry representatives, asking hard questions and facilitating a polite argument. In this episode, Peter Faust and Laurie Simpson face off to find out who is responsible for ensuring a safe working platform. Sponsored by ECA.
Welcome to DFI's podcast, Broadcasting Common Ground. I'm Lucky Nagarajan and welcome to Rumble, where we ask two guests to enter the arena and go toe-to-toe on topics relevant to our industry. And there is a referee that facilitates the discussion. For today's episode, our referee is going to be Chris Woods, who is going to be facilitating the discussion between Peter Faust, a good friend of mine, Vice President for Business Development for Malcolm Drilling, and Laurie Simpson, Managing Principal for Langan in Oakland, California, and also my industry BFF. Yes, we coined this term a few years ago. Chris, can you give us a hint of what is in store for us?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Lucky. In this episode of Rumble, we're going to hear from two folks on what we're considering opposite ends of the spectrum as it relates to a very important topic, working platforms for foundation construction. And we're going to get their thoughts as to who they think bears responsibility for them being, built properly. Here's our ticket for today, right? So in the contractor corner, as Lucky mentioned, we have Peter Faust. Peter's Vice President of Business Development for Malcolm, based out of their corporate headquarters in San Francisco. He's exceptionally well known in the industry for his efforts for developing working platform standards, specifically here in the United States, and will be providing his always unfiltered opinions from a perspective of the foundation contractor. In the consultant corner, we have the very well-known Ms. Laurie Simpson. As Lucky also mentioned, Laurie is the managing principal for Langan in Oakland, California. Her background as a geotechnical consultant in the Bay Area is, without words, she's very widely known and highly respected. Her most recent high-profile project, it was the successful completion of the Chase Center that many are familiar with, the home of the reigning NBA champion Golden State Warriors. So Laurie's going to be providing some input from the perspective of the consultant as it relates to working platform design and construction. So we're exceptionally grateful to both of you for joining us today, two exceptional experts in the field willing to join us on our Rumble podcast here.
Thank you, Chris. That's awesome that we have Peter and Laurie. A few months ago, I think I met Laurie and Peter for dinner in California, and we started talking about random things. And one of the topics was working platform. And I saw how both of them went toe to toe at the dinner table, talking about their differences and their, not so much of differences. So I think this will be really cool. So feel free to spill some blood. We will see how much blood can be spilled. Thank you so much for being here. So let's rumble.
Right. Well, good luck to you guys.
Thank you.
both.
All right. Round one. We're going to start out by talking about some of the issues. So again, Peter and Laurie, welcome. In this first round, let's talk about the issues with respect to working platforms. Working platforms really are a very big deal that are oftentimes overlooked in the construction process. Many times as well, the consequences of a poor platform construction can vary anywhere from, poor production, breakdowns to equipment. But there's also, and it's unfortunately too often, consequences that lead to the overturning of a very heavy piece of foundation equipment that could lead to significant injuries, significant damage, or even death. So let's set the stage here by talking about the amount of cooks that are in the kitchen when it comes to working platform design and construction. We have the geotechnical engineer. We have the general contractor. We have the earthwork subcontractor, who's likely the one that's actually responsible for building the platform. We have the specialty subcontractor who has to work from the platform. We shouldn't forget about the designer, if that potentially is a different person than one of the four entities that we've already mentioned here. Finally, not to be overlooked would be the special inspector or the testing agency that may have a role in testing and verifying the conditions of the pad. So Peter, let's get started with you here. Is it hard to understand why there's some difficulty here in how the responsibility and assignment of risk is decided, and separately how we're struggling to maybe gain traction with a standardized approach to working platforms given the lineup of people that I just laid out here?
To be quite frank, for me, it's not really hard. I think we all are responsible. Each entity has his part. Each entity needs to be aware on what it means to have a safe working platform. And I think we are maybe still here in the industry in this awareness phase that not all parties realize at the same time what it means, how difficult it is. And it certainly varies from job to job. Yeah? When we install small diameter tiebacks with a relatively light machine, the level of risk is something totally different when we approach large diameter auger cast piles with a huge machine, which puts a lot of track pressure onto the ground. Yeah. But overall, OSHA defines the responsibility as within the controlling entity. That's the word they use. And commonly we understand the controlling entity on most jobs is the general contractor. So if you want to spin the wheel back, he is the one who is responsible ultimately. But I feel we are all responsible. We're waking up in the industry. We're learning from each other. And it's not only the GC, we can play everything back and making the right assumptions and the right moves. Yeah. And certainly, if you talk about risk, we as the specialist foundation contractor, I believe we are at most risk. And this is, I believe, due to us running the largest equipment on site, running it in a condition where we need a stable work platform, running it in different weather conditions, yeah, wintertime, summertime, throughout rain. Nobody else has the toys we use. I believe very rarely you have false work erection, or you have precast elements which are heavier and require a bigger crane, a bigger lift. But we are the ones who are at highest risk that something happens to our people, our equipment. And I think we, in our industry, we have to drive this boat. We have to push the issue forward because it's our most interest. And when you going to the third question, the third part of your question, standardized approach, yes, that's definitely missing here in the US in the industry. Yes, we've seen something like this in other parts of the world. The UK started 10, 15 years looking into these issues after they had a lot of rig machines falling down, a lot of issues, a lot of damage. Canada followed. We have an approach in the meantime in Australia and New Zealand, and we definitely need one here in the US. And I truly believe we in the foundation industry, we are the ones who need to drive this boat.
That's a good perspective, especially when it comes to the risk aspect of things. I mean, a former colleague of mine and Lori's, frankly, George Kelly, used to always refer to having to leave your pile of gold, right? If something goes wrong on a job, everyone's invited into the litigation room, whether you're part of it or not. And the only way to get out of the litigation room is to leave your pile of gold on the table, right? So I think that's something that's overlooked in general quite a bit, that everyone has a part in it, and how do we move that forward? Lori, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So, I mean, I agree. This is a very important topic and something that leads to confusion and just lack of understanding. And I think when, we refer to the controlling entity, I don't disagree that usually points at the general contractor. And I think that unfortunately, the general contractor isn't in this conversation. And I don't mean literally, but they're not, as educated about this. And I know that when it gets brought up, they don't think it's their responsibility in so many cases, and they'll point to us as the geotech, or they'll point to, the specialty contractors who are using the site. But I think that controlling entity term is pretty important. Sometimes it gets pointed at the owner, but honestly, I don't think the owner really controls the day-to-day activity of the site. So I think it needs to be a conversation early on between all the parties involved, and really discussed and, decided who's taking responsibility for this. And really importantly, that someone is taking responsibility for this appropriately.
No, that's certainly a thoughtful way of looking at it. And you mentioned an interesting point to that is whether or not where's the owner's responsibility here, right? You come from the consultant side of things. My former life, I was working on the same side of the fence, and we're often faced as consultants with trying to deal with a sort of low bid approach, cut costs. The owners don't want to spend a lot of money necessarily up front on geotech work all the time. So, reports that you prepare as a consultant are generally provided to the various contractors on a job, the specialty subs, the GC, whether it's earthwork recommendations, foundation specific recommendations. Along those lines, when it comes to the owner, how often are you ever actually asked to include a scope of work that might specifically address this issue in your reports?
Yeah, that never comes up. That never comes up as a scope of work when the owner engages us to perform a geotechnical investigation for a project. I think that, it doesn't really come up until, we're going to construction and the specialty contractor starts asking about, what kind of surface are you going to prepare for us? And, they're looking at the room, right? They're looking at who in the room is going to do this for us. Right. In our reports, we will point out, it's likely we'll point out what, soil conditions are. Perhaps like once you excavate down, you're in a particularly poor condition, or maybe even at the ground surface if you don't have a excavation, maybe in wet weather. We might point to some constructability issues, and we'll identify the need for a safe, working surface. But it's not something that we provide recommendations for specifically.
Peter, you would, I guess, be maybe what we would consider being on the consumer end of these reports, right? You're provided these as part of the bid documents. Do you feel like when for the majority of the time, and I realize I'm painting with a fairly broad brush right now, right? But how often do you feel like you have sufficient information we're talking about an example here where maybe Malcolm would be involved in designing your own working platform or providing parameters. Do you feel like you generally have the information in a standard geotech report that you need? Or if you're not going to be doing it, at least to pass it along to a third party to design, perform some sort of design for you? Do you feel that that's generally sufficient data there?
Unfortunately not, I have to say. And I read a lot of geotech reports from various regions, various companies for various scopes of work. And yes, there are recommendations for earthwork, there are recommendations for piles, there are recommendations for shallow foundations. Everything is covered. Very little we find recommendations for work platforms, unfortunately. And I understand that at the time a geotech gets involved, a lot of unknowns are still there. If the geotech is lucky, he knows what building is being constructed, what elevation, maybe the grade has to be for construction, but means and methods are not known. But still, I feel there is room for improvement. Yeah, when a geotech makes a recommendation for a foundation element, be it an overcast pile, be it a drill shaft, be it a driven pile, he has something in mind what supports the structure and what works with the soil. He's experienced enough to also know and realize what it might take to install such an element. And based on this, and there's a broad variety of means and methods to get them installed. Don't get me wrong. Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't expect the geotech to know exactly what the contractor will propose. But based on this, I think there's room to also include recommendations for a safe platform. And maybe not necessary for every job. Yeah, some regions, they have such stable ground, they don't really care. But, and Laurie brought it up, or you brought it up earlier, the famous Warriors Stadium is, I think, a prime example of a very early identification of what problems are in the ground when you want to construct a stadium 20, 30 feet below grade, right into the very soft clay layer you can imagine, which we deal here in the Bay Area. What does it mean for the construction? And almost regardless of what size equipment is used, what crane is used, when it's going to be used, we're sitting on the softest material on planet Earth, and we want to put heavy equipment on it. What does that mean safety-wise? What does it mean cost-wise also for the owner? Yeah, an early recommendation in the geotech report to the owner, to the client of the geotech, telling, look, watch out, there's difficulty coming. You might have to do more than throw a little gravel on the ground and make it safe for the people you are employing to build your structure. That's certainly, I think, a good avenue, and that's something I think we all should get to and help ourselves be safe, help the owner to capture these costs, and avoid arguing and discussions down the road who's actually responsible or who missed it.
So let's stick with this then for a second, right? Because I'm hearing what you're saying in terms of recommendations in a report. We've also talked about maybe the need for a specific design based on a certain piece of equipment. You gave the example about a rig for soil nail wall. Maybe it's not nearly as heavily loaded as a big piece of foundation or drilling equipment, right? If I'm hearing you right, it sounds like you're saying we need to have these recommendations in the geotech report. But as you also said, the geotech likely is not going to be in possession of specifics as it relates to the equipment that is going to be used later on, right? Because, we know geotech reports could be done 3 years before a project breaks ground, right? So I guess the question to both you guys that we'll ask here to wrap up round one would be, you have recommendations in a geotech report that could be general, but you also may have a situation where you need a specific design for that platform. So we're talking about the actual design, signed and sealed. The outside perspective could say the geotech should do that based on the fact that they're drilling. The guy with the equipment could be the one to do it. The owner, right? We've talked about this a little bit so far. The owner could be the one, some people can make the argument that the owner's responsibility for safety on his own site. So if it comes down to a matter of signing and sealing a document for the design of a specific working platform, who do you think, Peter, I'll go to you first. Who do you think is legally responsible for that activity?
I would very clearly and straight out call this a temporary works designer. I consider a platform a temporary work. It's just the same as any shoring, any temporary shoring.
Correct. Yep.
Any trestle. We all understand when we sit over water on a trestle, this is a structure which needs to be designed and stamped. Any false work to erect a bridge over railroad or anything else needs to be designed and stamped. And I think a working platform falls under a temporary works designer's responsibility, whoever that might be at the end of the day. Yeah.
So that could be, so you're saying that could be internal to the contractor or potentially a third party designer.
Like we do with shoring design, sometimes handled by an external designer working for the owner, sometimes handled for the general contractor, sometimes it's the specialty foundation contractor who has the ability and proposes a shoring design, stamps it, gets it approved, and goes to work and is safe. And I'm saying this also because this temporary works designer needs the correct input from all parties. He needs to start with getting what I call the resistance values out of the geotech report or the geotech engineer. Yeah? needs the site conditions from a general contractor. What are we building, when and how? And also needs the input from the specialty subcontractor about the loads. The machine puts out a certain load onto this platform. Who knows about this? Is it the equipment manufacturer? Yes, he needs to give input to the subcontractor, who is the one who knows how to operate this machine. Only him. So all together needs to come together. All 4 parties need to come together and give input to this temporary works designer, who I believe should be the responsible party at the end of the day.
Fair
Hey,
enough.
I
So,
gotta
Lauren,
step in here. So
there you go.
Peter, I heard you say 2 totally different things. So I agree with this last part you said, which is a temporary works designer, and they get all the information about the very specific loads and the conditions, and they're the one who design it. But before, you said that the geotech report should have recommendations in there, and you indicated that the geotechnical engineer should understand what equipment is being used, so they should be able to provide recommendations for a working platform. But I absolutely disagree there. I think that, we can have an idea of what the equipment would be, maybe a little bit about the loads, but every machine seems to have its own set of load conditions, and depending on the pick and how far the pick is away, that's going to change your load conditions. And also, we could be conservative. Yes, geotechnical engineers often accused of being conservative for our own liability reasons. But, if we do that, no one's going to want to build, the working platform that we design if we go on a conservative route where it accommodates, any imaginable load. So I don't think it's going to be in our reports to do that. Also, as you said, it's a temporary works. And so it really might not fall under our responsibility as the consultant to the owner. It should, be an outside, separate entity, which could be engaged by the GC or could be engaged by you, depending on how that goes. But I really don't think that the geotechnical report should be providing these recommendations. We can be pointing to the adverse conditions, we can be providing the soil conditions, strength, whatnot, that will be encountered. But beyond that, that's not going to be in the geotech report, and I don't think it's our responsibility to do so.
I believe we can include a little more as an industry. Some countries have put out a framework of, this is the scope. We are installing piles from this and this size, using that and that equipment, type, size, and weight. And therefore, we have a range of this and this on track pressure. We assume, out of knowledge we have gained, calculations we have performed, that a certain scope of work is handled with a certain equipment size, and therefore produces a certain track pressure. And they put this in legislation. They have a table where everybody can pick and choose on what needs to be installed, what foundation element will require what stable platform. And I think this is a relatively easy way, even it doesn't define exactly what ground bearing pressure we finally might need. But this is a good starting point for a consultant to highlight to the owner, and I'd use the Warrior Stadium again, to highlight to the owner, look, here you need to go above and beyond placing 2 layers of 18-inch compacted gravel and maybe a geogrid in between. Here you have to do more. Yeah, you have to envision that you have to stabilize the ground in 5 layers, 6 layers, whatever it is, only because the conditions are so bad, because you want to install this and this element. And we believe that requires such a machine, which will produce this and this pressure. So I think as this information becomes more and more available and people are more aware, we're helping ourselves, to be safer. We're helping the owner to capture these costs, and we're helping us not fighting at the end of the day over what's really needed. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that Chase Center is a great example of a forward-thinking general contractor. They were pondering this question really from the very beginning, and really, working to solve it before they got there. And So that was a great example, and that's where I do think the general contractors need to be brought into this conversation. I think it's really important that they understand their responsibility, and forward-looking view will really be helpful.
Excellent. Well, guys, this has been a great first round. So I think we're going to take a short break here, and we'll be back for round 2. All right, everyone, we're back for round 2. So round 1, we spent really kind of focusing on what some of the issues are that exists when, with what comes with platform design. So we're going to shift gears now in round 2, and we're going to talk about how we actually go about fixing some of these issues, right? So Peter touched on it earlier in round 1 that, there are some countries where some traction has been made toward a working platform standard that may serve as a guideline within the industry. And, the places where the most significant progress has been made is where there's actually some form of ramifications to not following through with the guide, right? Because guidelines are only as good as they are if they're enforceable, right? I mean, if we got posted speed limit signs all over the place, but if you weren't worried about getting pulled over, who's going to pay attention to those, right? I mean, it is important to note, though, probably in some of these countries, there can be pretty significant differences to the procurement selection processes, right? And some different laws, maybe when it comes to governing construction risk. So, Peter, you obviously have, been very at the forefront of the charge here, trying to help lead and develop these guidelines as it may translate to the U.S., helping develop the EFFC DFI guide to working platforms. Can you tell us a little bit more about this effort and how that specific committee within DFI is actually working to get this document into everyday practice?
I gladly take this opportunity and do a little promotion for this effort. I was just looking it up. We started 2019. We put the first guide out with our European counterparts, and it was more an awareness raising effort that we wanted to highlight this topic to the industry. We wanted to show where we are. We collected, 150, 180 pages of attachment showing the different regulations around the world and different languages on different levels. And then we started digging in, realizing there is information out. It varies in terms of quality, but also in what direction different countries develop their efforts, and where a lot of differences. So this was for us a starting point where we formed the working group, and then we went into some details, asking more or less everybody involved, what's most important for you at this moment? And can you rate these? And surprisingly, the rating revealed that a lot of people here in the US, at least, were asking, since we're so far behind, mostly we contractors show up to the job site when everything is done, or everybody believes everything is done, and we are handed a platform which we were promised it's good enough for our work, and 95% compaction has been achieved. So go to work and be happy. And we very often don't really know if that's the case when it was placed. Is it in dry condition? Is it consistently 24-inch thick everywhere? And we have the risk of evaluating this within a day or two before we mobilize heavy equipment. So we were wondering, is there any easy, simple tool we can use to verify what was placed there by a third party or fourth party, and before we come out and mobilize our equipment? So this was the most pressing issue for the group, followed by a very surprising question about actual track pressure of our equipment. We noticed very early on that the information we get by in the manuals from our equipment suppliers varies hugely, and varies throughout time, varies in the way it is described or given to us, and brought up a lot of questions. And as we worked in this group, we realized in the UK, this came up already 10, 15 years ago. and they created actually an Excel spreadsheet calculator where everybody could put in his custom-made machine, be it an old one, be it a new one, and run these numbers for themselves, which sounded like quite a bit of challenge up front, but ultimately is not so difficult, but just gives us another tool to actually verify what pressure do we generate when we perform certain works. And people learned, oh yeah, of course, when I drill an auger in the ground, that's different than when I pull an auger out of the ground. And what is the resulting force, and what is the governed load case? And people were aware how difficult that actually is, and said, hey, we need better input. We need more clear guidelines from our equipment manufacturers about the work we do and what pressure are generated. And the third bullet point, very much to our surprise, after we actually send out what I call a challenge I think I invited 25 designers, consultants, engineers in the industry, say, hey, here's a live example. Can you tell me what capacity this platform has? And it's a live example we actually performed work on. And we were very surprised about the spread of results coming back. So we had 100% different feedback from people who were open and honest enough. 13 of them responded to give us their input. Yeah. And this told us, whoa, there is not only uncertainty on what input parameter you may use, even they got all the same geotech report, but there's uncertainty also what design model to use. And doing this, we realized, looking a little bit outside the US, realized, oh, other countries have done these comparisons and actually spent some time and effort and money to figure out exactly the same, that from the 10 available geotechnical design models, who, by the way, all assume a rigid foundation, which a track of a machine is not, found out that, yeah, there is a spread, and it's not necessarily a conservative spread. Yeah, there are load cases where we might be unsafe when we don't figure out what a proper design model to use. So we rated these three topics and said, these are three interesting topics we want to tackle. We started with the first one that is leading right now into what I call a field research study number one, where we have embarked into field tests. We have 4 instruments selected, which we believe will be useful. We purchased them through DFI and will make them available to anybody who's interested to try them, be it a contractor, be it a consultant, be it a GC. Whoever wants it can get them, can use them, can try them out, can learn from it, and give us a little feedback, not so much about the numbers, the values, the comparisons eventually, but more or less give us feedback how valuable they are for you. Is this a good instrument? Would you use this again? Is this helpful? Can your field guys, and this is primarily my intention, can our field guys run these tools? Are they simple enough to take them, run out before you mobilize and test the platform or test whatever you have, and have a better level of insurance that this is the right way and we can go to work safely, yeah, after the fact. Yeah? Not looking into design, not looking if the calculations were done right, just assuming there's no design, there's no calculation. We don't even know what's out there. Give us something.
From a more practical standpoint.
Yes.
I think that this tool and this evaluation is going to be really helpful. And I know we've talked with Peter about this, but I want to go back to referencing round one and a few things that Peter just said about the challenges of figuring out what the actual track pressures are, and the fact that they weren't even sure what their track pressures were, and it was hard to identify, and it's different depending on what activity you're doing. And that just, points to what a challenge that would be to even include something in the geotechnical reports to address. And I think it does point to how critical it is to make it a specialty service, once more is known about the equipment that's going to be used and how it's going to be implemented on site. But I just don't think it's appropriate to bring it in during the early stages of the geotechnical investigation. But you can just see how much uncertainty there is in the whole thing, and why it's critical in the end.
No, that's excellent point, right? It's again, right? The geotech report may be done considerable amount of time before the foundation construction's even happening. And a lot of geotech reports, you're even providing a bit of a Chinese menu, so to speak, to the owner in terms of various values or various foundation solutions that could be out there. So you may not even know what the foundation solution ultimately that's going to be chosen is going to be. So Lori, sticking with you for a second, I mean, one of the hats you wear, and people are well aware of this, is you've had a lot of code related experience in your career. So you heard what Peter just said about, soliciting information from the industry, developing this document, now going through with the next phase of some field testing that may or may not be used from a specific design, but more to just sort of verify the conditions in the field that things are adequate. But with this sort of effort, taking some sort of guideline or document, it's obviously down the road going to be enhanced by some of this data that Peter's talking about. What's the best way to try and get something like this from where it's at right now into a position of an enforceable document within building code or something along those lines?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The building code, generally speaking, does not address temporary works. There are some code provisions for temporary shoring, but in general, the building code isn't there for temporary works. So I'm not sure the building code is the place to go. But when it comes to, some other avenue, I would really look to our different, industry partners to kind of solve that. As it is, we're looking at, some other implementation of requirements that would speak to OSHA requirements. And we're finding, just through some research, how hard it is to get anything into OSHA. And so what are the other avenues to get these recognized either standards or, just even the industry practices document that's already been published. So I don't have a good answer for you, but I do think that, continuing to bring in our industry partners with, ADSC, PDCA, DFI, Geo Institute, bringing everybody in to agree this is important. I don't know who wouldn't agree. So agree it's important, right. And then really get it out there and educate the construction world about this. And you don't have to educate any of the specialty contractors, right?
Right.
It's the education to the GCs, the education to the owners, and then the agreement of where does this lie? And you can see there's different places this responsibility or at least design effort could lie. I would say that, a challenge that we face when, asked about this type of work and making recommendations is, when equipment changes are made or conditions change on site, either due to weather or just due to, other things out of our control, who's responsible for that when the working platform is no longer adequate, either because it's degraded or because different equipment's been brought out that maybe provides extra pressures or different pressures than it was designed for. So, there's a whole lot that can build into this, and, it's tricky to solve for sure.
No, that's excellent way of looking at it. So let me shift gears here then for a second, right? Because to this point we've been talking a little bit about risk and responsibility and that sort of viewpoint. Let's shift to the actual dollars here for a second, right? So, I mean, you've made it, I think, pretty clear here that your position is that this design is a temporary works. It's either a third party to the specialty contract or the responsibility of the GC, something along those lines.
Yes.
If, let me think of the right way to put this, but the scope, the design has to be based on something, right? So do you think it would be reasonable, even if you guys aren't, and when I say you guys, I'm talking the consulting side of things, right?
Yeah.
Is it reasonable to try
take
and
on
have
all consultants?
Right. Well, again, right, we paint with a broad brush on this show, right? But would it be reasonable to try and develop something where maybe a scope, not necessarily the design, but in terms of the type of information that would be needed to do this design, right? Because if the geotech's out there with a CPT rig or a drill rig or something, a lot of times that information is going to be what ultimately a design like this could be based on. So if that needed to be expanded a bit in terms of a certain type of testing or something along those lines, would some sort of standardization of a scope there that could become maybe more standard or more repeatable and being done with more frequency in geotech reports, would something like that be reasonable? Would that be a reasonable place for the consultants to be?
So I guess I don't see where the geotech report doesn't already provide the information about the soil. I mean, assuming that the exploration went sufficiently deep that you have data at the depth of interest. I guess I don't know why it's implied that the geotechnical report doesn't provide adequate information about the soil conditions that could be used to design the working platform.
I would have a wish list. I would wish
there we go.
Read in the geotech report just something like at the current grade, assuming that will be the final working grade, the soil as investigated by us is providing X amount of capacity. And if higher capacities are needed, improvements such and such need to be envisioned. That would be something. Or if the working grade is assumed to be 20 feet below grade, be aware there is a very soft layer which needs some extra care and improvement, which is above and beyond our scope. But something like this in an early stage, because us as a contractor looking at this geotech report at bidding stage, we don't have any means and methods to spend time or money or effort to look into this any deeper.
Right.
Yeah, and we have to rely on this information. Even in the large design build world, that's sometimes very tricky, where you have time and maybe money and resources to go in deeper. And this comes back to very early issue you had, how much money to spend up front. You know, how do we convince our owner spending a penny more at the beginning for good investigation is worthwhile?
So I think that, I think that very commonly our reports do identify, if we see an adverse condition at the, the working depth. And I think it's there. And, maybe this isn't, broad enough throughout the geotechnical world, and we need to do some more educating about it just so it's identified. But I would expect a specialty contractor to be able to look at a CPT log, to look at a boring log, find the depth of where they'll be working, and have some recognition that this is a poor conditions for their equipment. I would absolutely expect every specialty contractor can recognize a soft clay or a loose sand or, whatever.
I would agree. And I think we're learning that this might not be the case everywhere, and may come with the qualification and the knowledge of each contractor. But I think even the smaller guys are waking up or are now realizing, oops, I need to maybe spend a little bit more time instead of just writing work access as per general contractor.
Fair enough. Well, that's going to wrap up round two. So again, thank you guys for another excellent, informative round. Let's bring Lucky back in.
Here,
Lucky, let's bring you back in. What's your perspective? How are things going so far here?
I think this is a very interesting conversation they are having. Working in in consulting industry and being on site as field engineer for a very long time and working with contractors, I see both their perspectives, more of Lori's perspectives than Peter's perspectives, because I haven't been in that shoes a lot than Lori's. So I really like how they are, started standing their ground, but I can see how they both have their perspectives on what each other party can do to advance this, because this is a big problem in the industry. There is, to tell you the truth, in the last few months, or maybe last few, I don't know, I heard about working platforms a lot in the past, but I think after we chose this as the podcast title, or the topic, like I've heard this a lot in the conferences during networking. A lot of people are talking about this. That means that there is a problem. And, as Lori was talking about geotechnical engineers, they hardly, are involved all the way to the start of the construction or the end of the construction, right? Geotechnical report goes out and number of things can happen if you think about it. And sometimes they get a call, sometimes they don't get a call. And it is all on general contractor or the subcontractor to build it safely and make sure that it happens successfully and optimize the project. So I'm really happy that they also talked about, what is important to be in geotechnical report. And Lori spoke about what is in the geotechnical report and how that should be seen by a contractor. And of course, Peter agrees to some of it and does not agree to some of it. That's okay.
Yeah.
I really like that.
I mean, you mentioned a thing, and it's certainly not a rabbit hole we're going down today on this episode, but you do raise the interesting point of there's a lot of times where the owner wants to get slick and try and save a few bucks, and the geotech that does the report is not necessarily the testing agency or engineer that's in the field for construction. So that's a whole nother bag of worms that we're not going down today, but could be a real issue when it comes to this.
Yeah. And also, you ended it, the second round at the right time, where you said, who pays for this? Who is going to pay for this? Is general contractor going to take the brunt of it, or is the owner supposed to pay for it? Or are we going to figure out something before it's too late, before it's too late? And I like, both of them are very highly valuable and assets in the industry. And they have been working with technical associations a long time, right? As they were talking about the avenues, how this can go out, I can see something come out of all these conversations that we are having for so many years, like a task force coming out of it, and every technical association having one person dedicated to working. I hope this happens. I don't know if this is going to happen. I'm sure Lori and Peter will say the same thing. DFI, ADSC, GI, they all have one person who will be on part of this task force, and they will work together to see how this can be gotten out and explained to owners, contractors, and geotechs, and how changes can be made with respect to working platform seen more importantly. Very well done, I think, the first two rounds.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, both of you. And looking forward to round 3.
Excellent. We'll be back with round 3 in a minute. All right. Welcome back. We are here for our third and final round. So, we've talked about the issues with working platform design and construction. We've spent some time talking about some of the ways to improve the situation, right? So in this third round, we're going to close out with some final thoughts on, where do we go from here, right? So, Peter, let's start this one with you. What would you say? What's the most significant change that can be made right now to improve the understanding of the roles and responsibilities of working platform design and construction?
I truly believe, after all what I heard and what others have been doing successfully, I truly believe that the industry needs to agree on implementing what we call a platform certificate. And this certificate lays out guidelines on who's responsible for what, who does what. It goes as far as saying, okay, somebody needs to make sure that the platform is not only designed, but also placed properly and maintained properly throughout the 4 seasons or throughout its use, and should have clear responsibilities, and should be an established document in every contract. And since this is a safety issue, OSHA seems to be the right entity to anchor such a certificate. But as Lori mentioned, it's kind of hard to change OSHA regulations. That might take too much time. We all understand that this is nothing which can be anchored in a building code. So how does it get to the responsible parties is the big question. And we had some initial discussions in an industry-wide working group. And one idea was we need to get in front of the insurances. We need to make them understand they are reducing risk. They're making it a safer working place when they would maybe offer incentives for owners to implement such a certificate, to more or less tell their GCs, their builders, everybody else, hey, this is a format we'd like you to follow to make sure that your work's safe. And if the insurance companies offer a little incentive to the owner, I think the owner is driven by monetary means, this will trickle down fast. And we don't need to wait for a 10-year revision of the OSHA standard or find any other avenue. Yeah. How do we get to insurance is a different topic. Yeah, I'm not a lawyer, I'm an engineer. But this was one idea, and I think that was a very catchy idea.
No, that's actually a great idea, because people, no one really likes paying for insurance. Let's just call that what it is, right? But if there's a way to save money on it, then I think that would definitely get someone's attention. So, Lori, from your perspective, right? I mean, you've been pretty clear in terms of your stance with where the responsibility from the geotech lies. But how do you think in this instance, right? Peter brings up a good idea with insurance. Well, owners, a lot of times they're not necessarily familiar with the intricacies of foundation design construction. They just hire a GC to go build what they want to invest in, right? So what do you think? Do you think the geotech can help in that role? Is there something different? But I mean, could they help maybe in an education capacity with the owner? Or is there any other steps in the immediate future that you feel consultants could take to be more helpful moving forward with this?
Okay, so I'm going to take a little different tack to start. We need to change the terminology. I have had such a big issue with the terminology here, and I think that it can lead to confusion and a misunderstanding of what we're talking about. I mean, what is a working platform? When you say the word platform, I think you envision a structurally built, constructed element, a platform.
Right.
So when you call it a working platform, I think that people immediately envision something you have to build with lumber or steel or concrete, and that it's a much bigger element than it actually is. I think that the terminology is misplaced and should be changed entirely. So that's number one. I think the terminology needs to change to get people to actually envision what we're really talking about. What'd you say, Peter?
Really disagree. I think a platform covers all of this above and can cover ground, natural ground, can cover man-made ground, can cover any build-up, anything with fabric in between, a steel, like concrete, or even a wooden structure. Yes.
So I think that's a European point of view. And when I brought up this issue, when I first heard the terms working platform, I was told, well, that's the term they use in Europe, and we're bringing it here. And maybe it's a way of describing it in Europe that people understand, but I'm just going to say here in the States, you say the word platform, you think of a structural element. You think of something that is constructed not just of the earth or earth materials. So I think that is problematic. So that's number one. Number two, when you're talking about what can the geotechnical engineer do to bring this to the forefront, unfortunately, I think that not everybody reads our reports. I think that there's a lot of information in there. And unfortunately, I think people open up the report, go straight to the recommendations, find the numbers they need, throw them into their design, and they don't read all the words that are there to really talk about the issues and the things to be aware of and the things to, get ready for. So I think that, maybe geotechnical engineers could really point to this maybe more directly with less words, and maybe try to, highlight it in some way so it doesn't get lost in the report. Our reports typically have a construction conditions or a construction issues section, and it's just, things that we're trying to point to that might be things to consider during construction, and this would be one of them. But maybe because it's not an actual recommendation, people skip all that discussion and all the talking about it that we do in our reports. When we're talking in meetings, we can certainly bring it up more. I would say, it is a topic of discussion on many of my projects. And I think really then where the conflict comes from is, well, whose responsibility is it to take care of this? And that's where, it's like, okay, you geotech, you do it. It's like, well, no, that's not really our responsibility. Okay, you specialty sub, you do it. It's like, well,
Right.
no, you guys need to provide us a site that's ready to take our equipment. So, I think it's good when it does come up. And so you can go around the table and talk about ultimately who's going to do it. But yeah, I think it's important to bring it up early and often, make sure it gets addressed in some appropriate way.
Yeah, that's it. I think we can all agree here that, the time to bring it up is not when the equipment being mobilized to the site is on trucks and on the way to the site, right? It's gotta be.
Let's rumble a little. Early, yes, early is in the report. Early is my wish, have a section of recommendation for working platforms. Sorry, I have to bottle this back. Working platform, that terminology is branded already. It's
I
out.
know, I hate it.
It's going to be used, and people have acknowledged, and people are hopping on board. And yes, I'm a European. I'm sorry, but if it came from there. But I think in the meantime, people have understood what we're talking about globally. What do they associate with this? Might not be the right thing. You're right. We still have to do a lot on the awareness side. Yes, absolutely. I fully agree.
And Peter, please, this is a safe space for Europeans here. Don't worry about that.
Yeah.
But I do agree with you, right? And Lori, maybe not necessarily to the extent that you're talking about with steel or platform or something, but taking it to the other side, like with dynamic compaction that I do, I need a platform for my cranes. That necessarily doesn't involve building anything. That just needs to make sure that the ground is stable. So you've got everything from existing ground being stable all the way up through a designed and constructed, maybe it's, Peter gave some examples, stone with geogrid with stone, so there is something definitely there to the notion that you are having to construct something, whether it's steel, whether it's timber, whether it's just earth. But that's not always the case, right? That you're looking to necessarily build something. It could just be that what you want that's there to be stable, right? So I got one final question for and it'll be the same question to both of you guys here. So, we're at this point, we're having this conversation, and it's the topic of this podcast because working platforms can definitely represent a weak link in the foundation industry. I think it's, why we're here. We hear about failures every year. Sometimes the failures are catastrophic, sometimes they're not. But when you compare it to a bearing capacity failure of a foundation, right, which is something that never happens, right? I mean, the foundation design and construction itself is generally limited by settlement. So you're not even getting to the point of a bearing capacity failure. And again, we're gonna paint with a broad brush here, all of us, whether it's the consultants, the contractor, we all know how to study ground. We know how to quantify shear strength. We know how to improve the ground when we need to for various reasons. So in as few words as possible here, let's wrap this up with, why are working platforms such a weak link? And what do we need to do to just make them as safe as possible? Final thoughts. Laura, you lead off.
Well, I think they're a weak link because people don't think about them. So, bringing this topic to the forefront is important, and that will change people's understanding and planning for it. What to make them, you said as safe as possible. Well, I think as safe as possible within, a reasonable economic consideration.
Fair enough. Maybe as safe as required, or say maybe poor close of words, right?
I don't think it's hard to do. And it's really just a matter, and I don't think people disagree. Peter gave an example of widely varying, predictions of what a certain condition could support. So we all know there's not one single correct answer in geotechnical engineering, and there's some variety. But I think that it's a relatively straightforward question. And really the question comes to is who's going to design it? Who's going to build it? Who's going to be responsible for it?
I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, a key word. And I saw Peter actually agree with you on this one, early, right? It seems like that's a very good word here, talking about this early and often, and not just at the last minute. Peter, close us out. What are your final thoughts here?
I agree fully. Awareness is still not there. That makes it such a weak link. People do not understand. We're trying to improve this. And this goes all the way back to equipment suppliers who looked at me when I said, look, the loads you're giving me don't match what you gave me last year, or don't match this. And we're absolutely stunned. Yeah. And when we looked into design approaches, yeah, there is a huge spread, and we need to close that gap. And we need to make this as easy as possible for even the smallest subcontractor to understand and be aware of.
All right. The end of round 3. Lucky, what'd you think?
It was great. I really have to applaud both of them. Both of them had different perspectives on working platforms. And of course, I think I agree with Lori. Platforms is a very wrong term to use. Sorry, Peter, I have to go with Lori. Not because she's my BFF, but she is.
Time now.
Second time now, yes. No, I think we should have a better word for it. When you say platforms, even in India, I think you think about, a stage you are building. It is not of earth materials, but it is more of steel or concrete or any other wood or anything else. So I don't know, maybe we should call it stable ground. I don't know. I'm just saying that, and I like how they both, when you ask them what is future of working platforms, I think they both came up to the same conclusion of how the industry has to move forward and which direction it has to move forward. I'm really happy to hear that. So I can see a lot coming out of this. We have brought the conversation to the forefront, and all the work that Peter has been doing through DFI and Lori has been doing through DFI, and bridging to GI and other technical associations will definitely have some fruit in the future soon. Thank you both. This was amazing.
No, that's great. Peter, Lori, Lori, I've known you for a long time. Peter, I've met you a few times recently, just getting to start working with you a little bit, but you guys have been great sports. I can speak on behalf of our Rumble podcast group, Tim Siegel, who's not with it, Sebastian. We very much appreciate you guys joining us for this today. These kind of conversations are very helpful to the industry as a whole. And so, again, thank you guys for joining us. And is there any final thoughts from either one of you as we wrap up here?
It's just great to get to talk to this. I mean, you can see ultimately Peter and I don't really disagree on the importance of this and really how to get there. And maybe give us a glass of wine next time and we'll find something else to fight about.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe we need to stop recording these over Zoom and record them in a bar somewhere and we'll get somewhere, right?
We know each other since, 15 years, 16 years now.
Yeah.
I still remember the first day, quite frankly. So, and I don't think we're ever going to get in a fight, being with or without a glass of wine. If we're talking
that's a great idea. I think take the cameras where the action is.
Yeah.
That's it. So, well, excellent. Well, guys, this has been fantastic. It's been informative. I think the viewers are really going to enjoy this. So thank you guys for joining us, and that'll wrap us up. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone on the next episode of Rumble.
Listeners, don't forget to tell us if contractor won or consultant won or industry won. But I also want you to leave your comment on what you see as the future for working platforms. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right.
On behalf of DFI, we hope you enjoyed this episode. The views, information, and opinions expressed during Deep Foundation Institute's podcasts are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of DFI. DFI does not verify or take responsibility for the accuracy of the information contained. nor does it warrant that the information contained herein is suitable for any general or specific use. The podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. Editing, modification, or redistribution of this podcast is prohibited. Sponsored by ECA. Thanks for your time. Keep on surviving.